All right. Thank you, Forrest. Just sort of by thumbs up, are people able to see those slides? Perfect. Well, so here we go. We're going to cover a number of topics, right? So we're going to start with some conceptual pieces, try to make sure we have that good foundation, and then we're going to try and move into what this may mean for various different situations on campus. So it's kind of a full agenda. Definitely use the chat, and I will try to manage both the slides and keeping an eye on the chat. So bear with me if occasionally I pause just as I'm kind of looking back and forth. And as Forrest said, I will try to get through content and leave enough time at the end so that we can have more of those discussions off recording. So we'll see if we can manage that as well. All right. So in terms of the original proposal, the title that was developed was Supporting Neurodivergent Students Outside of the Classroom. And my process is always to really develop presentations from scratch because I feel like I need to do that to make sure I'm in the right space to try to share information that people want. And as I was going through this, I sort of came up with a secondary title that I felt was fitting with the information I was trying to convey. And what I came up with was carefully considering our approach to supporting community, right? So a lot of what we're going to get at is that idea of what can we do as members of a campus community to support people who might, come into our office or we see in the halls or we interact with somewhere on campus, and how can we help that go as well as possible? So hopefully that's consistent with what you're all hoping to learn about. So I'm trying to take a look at, where people are coming from, different roles, and think about responsibilities and see a wide variety of different backgrounds, which is great. And as we go along, again, please use that chat and I will try to catch those comments when possible. But we're really going to go through initially some of the foundational information, make sure we have an initial understanding of autism, the idea of neurodiversity, some on universal design, and then take all of that and start looking at where we have opportunities to support people on campus in a variety of different ways, right? So we're trying to merge these things, and then we'll end again with examples, and then we'll shut off the recording and can hopefully have some discussion. So that's the plan. We'll see how it goes. We can't discuss everything at once, though. So for these sorts of talks, the tricky thing is, where do you start? How do we start to build in the pieces so that we can then synthesize it and bring it together into a larger discussion of how do all of these things interact? With the additional complexity, if we're talking about a campus and really anything that's happening outside of the classroom, generally what we're talking about are less structured sorts of experiences, right? Where do you interact with a student or another person who might be on campus for various different reasons? And we're going to try and figure out what that would look like. So the things we're going to try and bring together are, this idea of autism, what are the implications, a tiny bit on the diagnosis, not to be diagnosing anything, but just understand what is the current definition of autism. We're also going to look at neurodiversity, think about what that entails and how that can maybe inform some of what we do. We'll talk about the university design for learning principles. Again, some of you may be really familiar with these things, so it'll be relatively brief, but also allow us to be on the same page. And then get into discussion and examples so that hopefully what we're able to do at the end of this is see additional opportunities for supporting progress, whatever that might be for a given person. So that's the hope. Lots of moving and interacting pieces, but definitely an important set of subjects. I wanted to say I appreciate the questions that were shared with the center. I tried to use these where I could, where it seemed to fit with this particular topic, to inform things like examples, inform discussion points, so that, again, hopefully, if you submitted questions, you're going to see parts of this presentation that impact or address, some of your questions and concerns, areas of interest. In terms of the size of the group, we're currently at 20. We already sort of did It's not ideal. I'd like to hear from more people individually, but for the sake of time, I think at this point we have a wide variety of backgrounds, so that's where I'm going to try to let the discussion, I don't know, explore.
Okay.
In terms of my background, like Forrest went through a lot of it. Really, the key to what I've been trying to do is throughout anything related to sort of special education and even beyond that, right? People who just haven't had the success they would like in traditional situations like general education. I've been working to understand how do we get to know the individual first, right? Because anytime something doesn't work as well as they would like, the idea is that there needs to be some other level of support that is offered. And ideally, we can help that person learn how to um, access what they need to feel success, right? So that's very applicable as we think about more of a university or post-secondary experience that we want people to be able to interact in a world that they're comfortable with, that makes sense, that they can feel successful. So if we jump into then just the idea of autism, what is it? And really going to start with just the technical sort of components here. And then as we get further into these different topics, we'll be able to kind of explore, so what does that actually mean on a campus? So autism is defined by patterns of behavior. There isn't a blood test, there isn't a brain scan that we use for diagnostic purposes. So if we just start with this particular diagnosis, it's identified through an analysis of how people interact. Sometimes it's framed as excesses and deficits, but again, if we also begin already to think of the neurodiversity sort of frame, they tend to look at this more as differences, right? And I'm not going to advocate necessarily for one or the other, but the idea is that you have a group of individuals or a particular individual that is engaging in some different kinds of behavior, and what can we do to support them? How can they experience the world in such a way that they achieve what their goals are? The specifics of the disability as it's defined really has to do with social aspects of the world, communication aspects of the world, and often impacts things like language, um, social interactions, individual interests, those sorts of things. And so that's where historically educational settings have had a hard time supporting individuals on the autism spectrum. Again, because they're introducing things that are different than probably the original intention of, let's say, a public school, right? So how can we sort of evolve, identify some reasonable steps to support everyone? And that's where, again, the idea of neurodiversity will come into play, because this doesn't really have to be just a discussion of autism. It just happens to be one area where these discussions seem to be really important. So aside from that, relative to autism, there are many different kinds of opinions on many different kinds of things. Like, is this diagnosis I just kind of briefly reviewed the most appropriate way to do it? Again, huge discussion. There have been changes in diagnostic criteria over the years. Another important discussion. The things that are contentious relative to causes, potential causes, non-causes, all of those kinds of things. So often people are interacting with this kind of information, and it's really hard to get answers. So honestly, I'm not going to try and get into those because it's sort of beyond the scope, but it is important to realize that there's this very large landscape of important issues that revolve and are related to individuals with autism. Here's a specific diagnostic definition in the DSM-5. Again, not going into it, but it just highlights that, when someone has autism as diagnosed by a person who can do diagnoses, they're talking about these sorts of things, right? So you can even see here in the language, they're talking about things like deficits. If we prefer the term difference, that's fine, but the idea is that there's something that is notably different about the way in which these individuals engage with the world, and more importantly for us, how can we support them? How can we help them learn to be successful in their lives? Practically speaking, if we shift away from the diagnosis, which, again, I don't do, most of us won't do, the idea is how can
I'll do
we
that.
help arrange, a campus experience that supports people who might have some of these differences? So we'll definitely get into examples having to do with things like motivation. We'll look at or consider things related to actions, right? So again, that's sort of these interrelated pieces of how to be social or how to communicate effectively, and consider what that might look like and what we can maybe do as we think about our roles and responsibilities to support people on campus who have some of these sorts of differences. So I have found it successful to frame these sorts of things as there's an initial challenge in that many of us have assumptions about common patterns of social motivation, uh, appropriate communication, those sorts of things. And it's based on a history of those things tend to hold true for most people, right? So a common example I use, if we think about a younger, group of individuals, you can often identify, 5 or 10 things that most 6-year-olds or most 10-year-olds or most teenagers enjoy doing, right? If you think about a general education classroom, or you think about, interacting with those age groups, there are some assumptions that we very quickly make that tend to hold true, right? If you talk about teenagers, it's things like, well, they probably want to be on their phone, they probably want to be away from their parents and family, they want to be doing certain sorts of things. Those assumptions become less valid as we move away from, sort of what is described as those typical groupings, right? So as we get into talking about an individual with autism, it's harder to make valid predictions based on those kinds of assumptions, right? So that's sort of the first step. And what we need to consider is, why am I considering, or what am I basing these decisions on? So quick check. I'm not doing as well as I would like getting into the chat. Let me make that bigger. Are there questions on purely the autism part of this in terms of the diagnosis? What does it mean? What does it affect? Again, we'll come back to some of it, but okay. If there are, go
I
ahead.
have one quick question for you.
Sure.
Um, you have the sub bullet in terms of like range of behaviors. Maybe folks have heard about the high functioning, or I know it's no longer in the current DSM-5, which is the manual for diagnosing different kinds of mental health disorders and challenges folks may experience. But can you maybe, and maybe this is something you're going to touch on later in this, but what is the difference, would you say, that distinguishes somebody as high functioning or who may have previously been diagnosed with Asperger's, versus somebody who just has maybe a more typical ASD diagnosis?
Good question. And we'll kind of have some of it. I don't specifically address it in that way because, again, the language gets somewhat tricky, but it's still a really valid consideration. So traditionally, that's been sort of delineated along the lines of something like IQ, or if you don't like sort of that idea of IQ, you can think of it as sort of complex verbal behavior, or um, sort of representational communication, right? The extent to which someone can discuss more abstract sorts of concepts is kind of the general area. And um, these days, it still can definitely sort of fit in the range of what is defined as autism, but that's where you tend to see it as sort of, um, higher order processing, language, critical thinking, problem solving, those kinds of things. Does that help? And that's about as
Mm-hmm.
short as I can go, but
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, it's tricky. And that's again where it's really hard to say as a group, what do people with autism look like? The idea is, again, we really have to get to know that individual, and then we can help, you know, support them working towards whatever their goals are. All right, let me find my chat again. Okay. So onto this concept of neurodiversity. So we'll talk a little bit about how it's been described and discussed and some issues to consider. Um, so here's a definition. If you were to, sort of do a search and look for reasonable resources, you would find something similar to this. So there's a small shift here from neurodiversity to neurodivergent. But what the Cleveland Clinic says is that neurodivergent is a non-medical term that describes people whose brains develop or work differently for some reason. This means the person has different strengths and struggles from people whose brains develop or work more typically. While some people who are neurodivergent have medical conditions, it also happens to people where a medical condition or diagnosis hasn't been identified. Right? So again, there's even some words in this definition that people might dispute, but hopefully the idea is coming through is that there's a set of individuals who have some difference, and that results in different strengths, and they use struggles, challenges, whatever your preferred description is. So if we take that sort of one step further, and the reason this is in green is it's a cue for me, it has to do with a question that was sent to us from you all. How will this person act? How will I know? And kind of what we're getting at here is, practically speaking, there will be some difference that's noticeable in some aspect of their interaction, either with themselves, how they behave, sort of non-socially, or how they interact with others, so how they behave socially, right? Those will be sort of the first clues, is that you notice, and maybe even can't put necessarily words or descriptions to it, that there's something different. People with typical development tend to notice these things very quickly. There's this pretty amazing social aspect to human behavior where we're not often taught those things explicitly, but we learn them, and it's very interesting, and there's a sort of magic to it that we could get into if we had more time. The breaking down even the term neurodiversity, so the neuro part of it we can't assess easily, right? We don't have ways to do that on most campuses. The diverse part of it we can, right? Because we can see the different aspects. So that's really kind of how we're going to move forward, is as you're working with people, meeting people, that will be sort of the first indication that maybe there's something different. And regardless if it's, sort of a case where that person would say that they are neurodiverse, doesn't really matter. The idea is are we noticing something that maybe we can adapt to? In terms of now starting to merge these two ideas of autism and neurodiversity, why is it worth discussing? So a number of potential variables are things like autism prevalence has been rising, or appears to be rising, especially over the last 50 years, and maybe even more so the last 20 years. And so it's something that we're probably more aware of now than ever before. And that sets the occasion to ask the question of, can we do something better, right? As an individual, maybe as part of a family, part of a community, larger culture, right? There are all these levels that we can consider. Is there an adjustment that would be appropriate? So that's, again, sort of how I'm framing this. It seems to be the question that you all are sort of asking is, what could we do to help people have a better experience? And if we think about something like autism or neurodiversity, are we going to be able to make some better decisions? If we're open to doing things differently, then we have another set of questions of sort of who decides, how do we decide, who takes action, what does that look like? So again, I see good evidence of that sort of process in the series of talks that have been arranged, right? Thinking about, what does this mean in general? What does this mean in the classroom? What does this mean outside of the classroom? What does this mean in terms of support services? All of those kinds of things are very good questions to begin to answer, these kinds of parts of the question. So a little bit more in depth on that question of, how will I know, right? Is this person I'm interacting with neurodivergent? It can be observable in a number of different ways, right? So again, the social world is very complex. It's somewhat magical. And we notice things like sounds, eye contact, body language, tone of voice, those sorts of nonverbal communication very quickly, those might be the first sorts of things you could notice, right? Again, it could be as simple as walking down the hall, you notice some of those things differently. Someone approaches you, you approach them, and there's something about their body language or tone of voice or those sorts of things. We're not explicitly taught most of those things, and yet there does become that thing that we call, sort of the norm in terms of social skills. When there's some variation there, again, that might lead you to say, I wonder if. And it's just maybe a good reminder to start thinking, how could I do any number of things a little bit or a lot differently? And so it's that next step that we're really going to talk about for the rest of our time together. A side note here, different people will experience this thing differently. If you interact with someone that is displaying different patterns of behavior, it can just be perceived as, okay, that's different. Or I'm noticing something, right? A very sort of value-free identification of something. Other people might initially identify this thing as good, bad, and comfortable. It's important to ask can we approach it? And again, that's where my experience I've learned over the last 25 years, I really just approach it as, okay, this is what I saw. What does it mean? Right? And if my role is such that I can provide help or assistance or, whatever, what would that look like? Right? So it's very sort of value free. That fits very much within sort of the neurodiversity movement, the idea that it's a difference and we don't need to start to say typical or atypical or good or bad, but just different. So what can we do? Different fields explore these things in different ways, right? So I just have a couple examples here. I know the text is very small, but the idea is a lot of different fields look at this and they approach it based on, the field that they're in, right? So neuropsychology versus something like social psychology versus cognitive psychology versus behavioral psychology. And these are just the psychologies, right? You could easily expand this into other areas as well, right? So again, a lot of people are trying to answer the question of how would I know and how do we do something about this? In terms of the big picture, the other sort of, I think, final piece that I'm layering in here at the beginning is just the idea that at the university level, we're often talking about individuals where self-determination is a big part of it. And so if we define that very quickly, just a simple dictionary sort of definition is it's the ability or power to make decisions for yourself, right? It's an important contextual piece because that is very different from working or supporting younger individuals where you might have an IEP team, family, parents, all of those additional layers are added in at the level of a college. We're working with people where self-determination is incredibly important and needs to be a part of our considerations. So how that influences my specific work, just as an example, is I focus on helping a person achieve their goals in line with their values. So things like independence, things like that experience of satisfaction, right? The questions I ask and the things I try and support are helping them express those things and working with them to help them make progress towards those things. It's not me from the outside saying you should or shouldn't. It's rather you tell me what you're looking to do, and we'll try to identify ways to get you there. I see a question from Jan that I'm going to jump back to just really quick. Is the rise in diagnosis a result of improved diagnostic means or thought to be environmental? And that's the thing. I don't think there's solid evidence that would allow us to conclude one way or another, right? And so the tricky thing is we have kind of these layers of analysis going on of can we answer that important question? And whether we can answer it or not, what can we do to help these people live lives that are, more satisfactory for them, where they're more independent? There's some evidence that there are environmental factors, but no one yet has been able to pinpoint exactly what that is. There definitely have been changes in diagnostic criteria. So again, that definitely plays a role, but it's not clear exactly how much of a role it plays. So really good questions, really tough to answer. All right. So another quick check on neurodiversity. Hopefully, sort of the flavor of this makes sense if you haven't encountered it. If you already know, I probably didn't teach you anything new, but again, just in laying these foundational concepts. Any questions here? Okay, well, I will keep moving. If anything comes to mind, just type it in the chat. All right, so now if we begin to think about how might we start to support neurodiverse individuals, one of the key processes we can go through is to look for frameworks that can help us address differences, right? We should want to find something that will help improve outcomes. One thing we can think about is this idea of universal design for learning, right? With the key being, if we can make better decisions using this framework, what we're able to do then is avoid mistakes when our, assumptions are inaccurate. And again, that's part of this particular analysis and one way to break it down. So again, you could have a whole series of talks, you could have whole coursework devoted to universal design for learning. I don't claim to be able to cover all of that at that level here, but the idea is what it is a framework that allows us to really identify key aspects of the learning process. Again, helps us reduce assumptions and consider some alternatives, right? And so they break it down into 3 areas. You'll see a number of different graphics similar to this, looking at particular areas. Here I summarize these components as engagement, representation, action, and expression. The idea is we're trying to account for differences relative to things like motivation and interest, right? Is there a way we can structure some topic or lesson to help people be more interested in that particular thing, right? That should lead to better engagement, better retention, all of those sorts of things. So the initial question is, how can I draw you into this thing, whatever it is? The representation component has to do with sharing information in different sorts of ways. Again, in case someone has particular strengths related to one thing versus another, or find certain kinds of content difficult when it's presented in particular ways, right? We're trying to provide opportunities so that more people can contact that in a reasonable and accessible sort of way. And then the third piece is action and expression, right? So now that we've done some of these other things, or while we're doing them, it provides opportunities for individuals to demonstrate, some learning, some expertise, some, expression in different ways, right? So instead of just saying write a paper, it can be expressed in a number of different ways. So it's a way to break down these learning opportunities and consider what are the fundamental pieces that go into this overall process that we call learning, right? So motivation, sharing of information, and demonstrating some learning that may have happened. Hopefully that's making sense. Again, goes much, much deeper. But we can then use this as a framework, maybe, especially for in-classroom experience, but we can also take it further and look outside of the classroom and think about what kinds of things are likely to come up and how can we consider motivation, sharing of information, and demonstrating some learning or knowledge. So really quick, I know, but questions on that? Okay. There will probably be more of this in other topics as well. But so now that we've kind of covered that, what it's hopefully going to allow us to do is take all 3 of those things and kind of synthesize it into maybe some new action, think about some different ways we can actually work with people across the variety of different roles and responsibilities you all have. And again, for this talk, it's really focused on that wide variety of things that can happen really across the campus outside of the classroom, right? In some sense, there's a nice structure in a classroom where you can break it down in terms of what are students typically doing across different classes on campus. Here we're thinking about, all right, now they leave that class. What might they experience, right? And it could be anything from just navigating campus to going into a particular office to trying to identify information. All of those kinds of things are sort of fair game. A quick aside here before we get into it, because now we're getting into sort of the analysis and the synthesis part of it. We can make a number of mistakes that we probably don't need to if we're not conscious of how we're approaching a particular topic. So we're going to need to try to balance thinking about both groups and individuals, and they require different kinds of analyses that I hopefully can illustrate with a couple examples. There's a fundamental error in applying a group finding to an individual, and that has to do with the difference between sort of group research or group decision making versus individual implementation of something. So a really good example of this is available in medical research that most people have encountered at least in some way, where the idea is research at the group level can show that ibuprofen is effective as evidenced in things like random controlled trials, right? The idea is that one group received ibuprofen, another group didn't, and they found that the group that received ibuprofen had some improved outcome related to something like pain reduction. Where the error can come in is if we say, okay, now everyone should use ibuprofen, or you should use it, and you'll have the same 80% reduction in pain. That's not how it works. What those kinds of decisions allow us to make is that now if we had two more groups, if we applied ibuprofen to one of those groups, we would likely see the same kind of outcome. It's really important because part of what we're talking about here is how can we help individuals who go to campus? But that's different than asking the question of now I'm meeting or interacting with someone, how can I help this person? Right? So one can inform the other, but it's not the whole story. You might give ibuprofen to an individual and it's the exact wrong thing to do. And even in that random controlled trial, there were individuals in the group that got ibuprofen who had bad outcomes or no effect, because the measure that they report is for the entire group and difference between groups. This also happens at the level of cities, right? So overall population, there might be rules or regulations that are designed to help the overall city, and yet there'll be particular things that influence an individual, such as something like maybe there's a new regulation on businesses, and a subset of those businesses are worse off because of that new regulation. For school districts, maybe something a little bit closer to home for what a lot of us are doing. A really concrete example is a district would hopefully select a new reading curriculum based on the fact that there's documented improvements in reading, say by 20% improvement in average scores. That doesn't mean every student improved by 20%. There are some students who did the same or worse. But what it means is, on average, if we're going to roll this out to a district, we should expect to see on average a 20% improvement across the district. The fundamental question then becomes, but what are we going to do about the people where that didn't work? That's kind of what we're trying to balance here, right? So we can think about things like neurodiversity and insights from that. We can think about things like universal design for learning. What insights can we get from that? But we're also going to need to remain flexible enough to say, okay, I kind of know where to start. I know maybe what will make sense to try, but also I need to be aware that we need to be adaptable to an individual who that might not be the right thing. That's really us, right? So we'll talk about both of these layers, but we need to be aware enough to say, I just tried something. Doesn't seem like it was the right thing. What's my plan B, right? And it's sort of that flexibility that's both challenging, but also allows us to be really effective. So to do all of this, we're going to try and make valid predictions, considering reasonable steps based on what these things are, right? So that's where I'm going to propose we can make improvements on most campuses in the way we think about sort of our universal design kinds of features. But also think beyond that and say, okay, but what if that doesn't work? Or what's an alternative, right? So that we're ready to go with another option. We're not locked in necessarily, but we kind of go through this process that allows us to be supportive and allows our students to experience success. Ultimately, just like in public schools where we have different levels of support, that's a pretty good model where a school might make adjustments in things like their curriculum, reading programs, things like that. They train teachers and other support staff to interact more effectively with neurodiverse populations. But there's also going to be a level further down that process where maybe there's more specialized support. So you need to really think about sort of that whole range. And we're, for today, going to really try and spend our time kind of in that middle section of what can we start to do if we're not the specialist, but we're still interacting with someone who may present as having some differences. So here's where now we can really cycle back into the different aspects of things we've talked about. So we started with the autism piece. That allows us to make certain kinds of predictions in terms of where might challenges arise, right? In some interaction with a particular individual on campus, we might see challenges or differences related to their social communication. So if that happens, what do we say? When do we say it or not say something? Who are these things being said to, right? We can start to consider that part of the interactions. We can also predict there'll probably be or could be some challenges related to problem solving, right? So when things become different, many individuals with autism have a harder time, right? Because that requires a certain amount of flexibility that is a central challenge, that defines autism. So what do we do when there's something that we can predict might be unknown or unexpected? So just as a quick sort of jump forward, the idea is we want to work on developing our skill set to kind of look around and say, when might something change or be different? If we can identify those things, now we're in a position to say what could be a different resource, what could be a different approach. It's a real challenge because that's very effortful to think, I tend to do my job in this way, but now part of what this means is maybe we need to say, I do it in this way, but what might someone else experience and what might help them, right? So it becomes a very reflective sort of practice and maybe a different way than we've reflected in the past. There could definitely be challenges related to things like managing complexities within a university setting, right? So it's a lot that goes on with scheduling, planning, organization, time management. It's very different than something like a high school setting where your schedule is pretty set out, it's pretty routine, it's fairly similar from day to day, especially as compared to a campus where you might only be going a subset of a day and maybe only some days each week. How are you going to manage that time? There can be challenges related to what we might call coping or emotional regulation, right? The idea is there are a lot of intrapersonal, right? The things we feel, think that can be challenging under all the other conditions that happen on campus. So what can we maybe do to support some of those things? There can be things related to sensory focus sorts of experiences. So a lot of individuals on the spectrum can react differently to things like particular sights or smells or textures or sounds or sort of the chaos that can occur in highly social situations of a student union, a cafeteria, a gymnasium, a quad, whatever might be, sort of more socially active on campus, right? So a list of some of the things that could be challenging. So again, what I'm proposing here is that the more aware of these kinds of things and how they can be experienced by someone with, some neurodiversity like autism allows us to then say, okay, so what could we do instead? Or how could we help this person have resources that they need to manage that or predict that or engage in that situation? That's a lot to think about, just maybe by show of thumbs up. Is that making sense? Okay. Hopefully it's a lot. And that's why this stuff is tricky, because all the simple things we can do have been done, right? Like campuses make those changes pretty well, right? We're thinking about our students. We're trying to have them come and be ready to go. High schools try and prepare most students to be able to do some of these kinds of things. And it's when all of those sort of low-hanging fruits have been addressed that we're faced with kind of what's that next thing that can be really pretty tricky. So again, sort of back to a connection to another area. So we have these layers, right? So in terms of medical research, the layer that's added in so that not everyone just gets ibuprofen, to use that earlier example, is we have a primary care doctor, right? Because ibuprofen works by definition at the level of groups, at the level of the individual. You don't just take medication, you have someone who can help prescribe that thing. Is this the right thing for you? Universities are often the same, right? We set up a university so that most students can come in and they're prepared to get a useful experience towards whatever their goals are, based on different fields, different interests, different things like that. Within the university, sort of the analogous piece is we have individuals, staff, members, and different roles. It's not a perfect analogy because we're not prescribing medication, right? So there's some difference, but the idea is we also need to be flexible within that university system to help an individual in accessing the experiences that are useful for them. And that's where, again, depending on what your role is, we have a number of different kinds of roles here. What is it that you can help this person get to know? And it might be just a real sort of day-to-day passing. They come into a library or they come into a particular location on campus and you have a focused interaction about a particular thing. Other roles might have something where it's uh, a broader reaching sort of experience. And the way in which we can help could look very different, right? For one group of people with um, a different sort of role, it might just be in adjusting our language. For other people, you might consider adding additional sorts of resources in the way you communicate information, right? So lots of different options based on the kinds of things you're likely to be doing when you interact with a variety of different people. The key piece here is noticing and identifying potential follow-up, right? This is really sort of the first step, is asking that question of how might I interact with this person? And then consider things like availability of resources. Are there things we could add in? Usually, if we can do that, it'll include improving how specific the information is that we give. And we'll talk about some examples of that as we get further into this. Like we're kind of beginning to go deeper into what this actually looks like. And then adding in cues for options, right? So the idea is helping a person become more aware of the kinds of things that are opportunities. So still a lot to think about. Trying to be very careful in laying out this framework, because I think that's really the fundamental challenge to doing all of this, is figuring out how is it that we can get to the point of making predictions that are going to be different based on roles, use what we know about autism or neurodiversity, universal design for learning, to then take action and do something differently than we did last month, last year, 5 years ago, whatever the case may be. I see a question in the chat, example of cues. We'll have some of them, but it's things like, where do we interact with students? Could it be through email? Could it be through a sign in the office? Could it be through an orientation where we say, essentially, here's a decision point, be thinking about these options, right? Or something like, if you experience this and you still have questions, do that. So it's often going to be some sort of communicative thing at the level of a campus. And that's where, again, it's challenging. You have to look around. Where do you sit? Where do you walk? Where do you spend your time? So that you could notice, if someone came to me and things were going differently, what else could I present? It could even be, depending on your role, maybe it's something like a business card. Maybe there's a QR code that you show them that takes a link, right? But those kinds of things, so that they have an option basically to experience, I'm not understanding this, or this isn't the best way for me to access it, and we have a plan B. So I know that's not perfect, but like I said, there'll be a little bit more as we move on too. Good question. And then we use that to plan, right? So we'll have, that's what we'll look at. We'll have some more concrete examples as well. So information sharing, and I can't see ahead of my slide, so I should have just said, well, actually, let's look at our next slide, but here we are. So examples that we can actually use, right? So focused on information sharing, some of the ways we can do this is considering visual formats that clarify information, right? So instead of describing something where it's like, oh, and remember when you go into the dorm or when you go to this location, when you go to the library, right? There's a lot you have to remember and organize. But if we have things ready to go, and some of this you might have, so maybe it's a non-issue. If you don't, these could be options to consider. Or you might say, we have this, but I can't get to that quick enough, right? So maybe you have a stack of papers, maybe you have that QR code, maybe you have one of these things ready to go. But things like checklists, step-by-step instructions, like really think, if I was to do this and I'm writing down what I'm doing at each step, create that list. We sometimes call it a task analysis in special education, but the idea is really breaking it down, focused on first you do this, then you do this, then you do this. Can be in the form of video tutorials, right? Really great thing to work with students on if you work with students, right? The idea is let's set up some of these things where how do you do X, right? Whatever that thing is, because again, it might only be 5 or 10 people who ever watch the video, but guess what? That's now 5 or 10 people who got better information because that worked for them. There are some students who might even use that video to follow along. Like maybe it is a very sort of anxiety producing situation, but if they have that video and before they do the thing, they watch it, that might help them engage more effectively. Decision trees, right? So for things where it isn't just a process, but you actually have to start out, get to a point where you need to decide by having a decision tree, that's actually laid out and can help maybe guide their decision making. Study guides, again, it doesn't just have to be for class, but what's the thing they're trying to learn, right? You might have a way to help them learn about using the card catalog in a library. Might be about how to set up other sorts of things on campus, an exercise routine. Might be, any number of things. And then honestly, one of the things that's most time intensive, but also potentially the most helpful is multiple examples and models, right? So the easiest example of this that I can speak to from experience is helping individuals learn to solve problems requires lots of example problems because once you solve a problem once, you're no longer solving that problem, you're just doing the thing that worked last time. So to learn to be a really good critical thinker or problem solver, you need a whole bunch of these things so that each step you're kind of faced with that question of, uh-oh, I don't know, I need to think it through. So having lots of examples and models allows people to get the essence of a process without just following specific guidance. So anyway, lots of examples with sharing information, but that's the idea. And for part of what makes this talk challenging is I'm not speaking to just a particular role on campus, right? People are doing lots of different things. So you have to be able to stop and say, how might this fit with what I'm doing? And for some of you, maybe none of it fits. For some of you, it might be right in sort of your wheelhouse, so to speak, for the kinds of things that could come up. Fundamental question is where and when, right? Where or when could these things be helpful? Again, so that when it comes up, you have it ready to go, right? So it's upfront investment so that if someone comes into your office, you see them in the hall, you're ready to go with some of this. So I said some of these, but again, these are the kinds of examples that hopefully will, help some of you think of how this could be applicable. Again, it's initially high effort because it's looking at the campus in a very different way than you have in the past, but might be finding a campus resource, navigating a physical space like a library or something else, using some tech resources, right? Think about what is it that students are doing when they come to campus? How could we clarify that? Could be social situations. Again, what are students doing on campus? How could we help that? Might be something, a clearer example is ordering food, but, I keep sort of, my mind goes into the classroom. So an example for in the classroom would be, how do you start to engage in group work? But what kinds of other social situations come up outside of work? Maybe it's joining a club. Maybe it's, navigating some other student space. Maybe it's a computer lab, maybe, I don't know. But that's the idea, is we're thinking through, where could these opportunities exist? Any thoughts here? Is that helping clarify what the examples could look like? And honestly, the tricky thing is where to put these in, right? Because traditionally, we haven't made these adjustments. And again, that's where neurodiversity, universal design for learning is helpful, because the idea is it's worth the effort, right? It's worth thinking about, how can we make this experience more accessible to all kinds of people, right? People who traditionally haven't been here or have struggled more than they maybe need to. In this case, it might just be a simple case of, how else can we share the information? So thinking about clear communication, right? So there's some overlap here, but the idea now is, how can we actually express whatever information in whatever form in such a way that it's more likely to be effective, right? So because we have a lot of subtle social cues that we may respond to effectively, it's important to realize not everyone else will have that same experience, right? So how might our everyday communication be more accessible through things like, instead of asking a leading question, we provide explicit, clear information, right? So just an example that could come up, someone says, do you think that was a good idea? Well, for someone with neurodiverse perspective, honestly, yeah, it probably was a good idea. And the point is, we asked a question in a way that had certain assumptions. On the other hand, if something was more socially appropriate to do differently, was safer, was within, sort of guidelines for how things are going on campus, we'd be better served to probably just say, next time, please do it in this way, right? And we can give the reason if that's appropriate, but the idea is we've clarified the communication. Being aware of things like tone of voice. Obviously, more extreme examples are things like sarcasm, jokes, idioms, where, again, it can just mask some of the meaning for certain people. For us, it's often just thinking, okay, is this an effective way to say it? What it really allows us to do is clarify those kinds of things, so that, again, it becomes more accessible, right? And there's overlap here with other areas that may be familiar too, right? Thinking about things like cultural competence, right? If we're only speaking in such a way that people who grew up in Connecticut will understand, that's going to limit the effectiveness of our communication. But there's a lot here, right? Because most of our initial interactions with people on campus are where these things may come up, right? Because it's our more informal social interactions, especially if you're in the hallway or someone just comes in the office. It's worth asking, is this as clear as it could be, in case someone, is experiencing life in a different way, sort of through this neurodiversity lens. So, asking yourself, are you prepared to adjust your language? If you are, maybe you already do it. If not, how could those adjustments be made? If we're thinking about information that we've actually prepared already, it could be things like looking around to see, is there a resource we could create on steps to checking in with a professor that fits on a business card, right? So now it's merging just from the social language as we experience it to, maybe there's something we can do on the front end that can help with these sorts of things. Or if we know, maybe in student social situations, that there will be, informal language that can be hard to access for some people, right? What can we do to support those students in adjusting their language? Or how can we help someone be ready to ask different questions, right? So I didn't understand that. Could you tell me that differently, right? Having those sorts of things could be helpful. Again, video information for these kinds of things there's very good research on what's called video modeling. And the idea is because so much of social interaction is those subtle social cues, having videos often does a better job than just written, right? Because how do you put in words all of those things about tone of voice, eye contact, body language, social spacing, those kinds of things? Videos can do a nice job of starting to articulate that. It allows you to highlight social space, nodding your head, active listening, those kinds of things. All right, moving on to another feature that is really important in sort of a common area that comes up when you're thinking about neurodiversity and how that's experienced is this idea of perspective taking. There are different terms people might use, but the idea is, are you able to understand some of what another person is likely experiencing, right? Even something as concrete as it was raining outside, they came in, they're wet. Do you notice and respond to the fact that this person is actually now probably physically uncomfortable, right? That's a very sort of early level of perspective taking. But you can go deeper into thinking about what if someone said something about they missed their bus to campus, or they have a really difficult exam, or they're worried about a paper, right? Responding to those kinds of cues can be really, really tricky. So we can start to think of how that might influence what we're doing, um, and support students in engaging in different behaviors. So some common areas where this sort of thing can come up have to do with the comments people might make, right? So they might make a comment that could be perceived as inappropriate or unkind or rude or disrespectful or any of the labels we use to describe those kinds of things, right? So what might we do about it? Could be things related to eating at an inappropriate time or an inappropriate way. Again, as defined by whatever setting they're in. Could be things related to personal care, right? Where part of that is staying within what, on a campus is considered socially appropriate. Could be certain movements in a hallway, in a public space, things like that. Again, the idea is as we think about individuals with autism, they sometimes engage in different kinds of behaviors. And there's an important discussion to be had with what is appropriate for the situation, what isn't, how do we address that? And it might be on the level of people without autism and saying, like, that's really not a big deal. Maybe you shouldn't speak like that. Maybe we should be more willing to accept some differences. But for other people, it might be a different kind of discussion, right? So lots of ways in which this can go. This is really meant to just highlight how can we start to make predictions about this idea of perspective taking can be related to things like habits or bad habits. And just helping people, again, learn to respond to whatever is valued within, sort of our campus community. Clarifying those sorts of things, having resources to help illustrate why it's important to not be excessively loud in hallways or, whatever the thing could be, right? Has to often do with perspective taking and respecting, sort of that community space and question in the chat. How do you approach inappropriate level for someone that is neurodiverse? And again, it's a good question to illustrate how it isn't a simple answer. The idea is, I think it would need to be at some level of discussion with people on campus to say, where do we think we value, these kinds of social features, right? So how can we adapt what we're doing? And that can then guide what we're doing, where I always default to, in the moment, there, as kindly as possible, might be something you bring to the person's attention. I don't know if you've noticed, but some people might perceive that as really loud. But that's never going to be the perfect thing, because the idea is I would say, let's go back and say, what can we now add into support for people to help that be a more reasonable conclusion, right? So discussions with the campus, there might be videos, there might be different kinds of discussions, asking questions, those kinds of things allow us to set up more of that community understanding that, for an academic setting, above a conversational tone might be perceived as too much, right? So I can't give you the simple thing because honestly, I don't know what the situation is where it would come up, but I think those discussions are what's really important. And then you include people from different perspectives into that discussion and figure out where do we fall as this community. And then you can move forward with how you support it. Does that help? Perfect. Yeah, and that's what makes this stuff so tricky and why, honestly, a lot of times communities aren't making some of these adjustments because you have to have the discussion first. It can't be just one person jumping in and saying, well, that's too much. Let's have a discussion. That's the whole point. When everyone's on the same page, formally or informally, the challenges don't come up. And what we're saying is think through these different kinds of things. Let's come up with different ways. If we even sort of reflect back to the universal design for learning piece, the idea is well, why would someone be motivated to follow a particular convention for voice volume, right? Well, maybe we need to have that discussion of think about how we're on campus to be really productive, right? And what's your role in helping other people productive? Is that meaningful? Okay, and then how can we contribute to that, right? So there can be this discussion that might get at motivation where initially the person thinks, well, it doesn't matter if I'm just a little loud, it's only a couple minutes and I don't think it's that disruptive. But now if we have a discussion of motivation, they might see things in a way that says, oh yeah, actually I do think that's important, right? So there's been, through information, a shift in motivation. It could work out differently too, so. The point is, once you have those kinds of things, right? So what kinds of situations can come up that are related to perspective taking, where people will see things differently, experience things differently? How do we find that common ground? And then once we do that, how are they posted, right? So I sort of just covered the how are they determined part, right? Usually through discussion, right? Because it's really fundamentally a discussion of values. How do we want our campus to run? Or if it's a particular department, particular building, a really, usually clear-cut example is a library, right? The convention since libraries have been around is generally that it's sort of a quiet space because people are often doing a lot of reading, right? So that one's somewhat predetermined, but there might be different parts of the library with different expectations, right? How do we then clarify that? We can't just assume, well, it's a library, everyone knows. The idea is as well, maybe not. Maybe that isn't as clear or the specific volume isn't clear. So what do we do? Do we post it? Do we remind people? Do we send emails? Can we have other examples? And if things go differently, how do we respond, right? Whose responsibility? How can we say that in a kind way? How can we help people understand why it might be important, even if initially it isn't? Those kinds of things. And then having the systems to politely share and enforce those. And then how can differences be accommodated? So it doesn't just have to be everyone follow this rule, right? So maybe it's something where there really are just different perspectives. Okay, so what do we do about that? Maybe there are different spaces. Maybe there are different times. Maybe there are different sorts of things that can be arranged to address that. But it's hard to talk about those things in general because the idea is we should be responding to the specific needs of the situation, and that leads to better solutions, right? So best example I can think of off the top of my head is the library. In theory, if there is a reason and there is enough motivation from some of the community to say, I don't think we need to be that quiet in a library, right? Like people can still read. A lot of people have headphones. You can check things out. Maybe it's based on schedule. Maybe you create a different location, right? Maybe there are some things that could sort of be outside the box, so to speak, in terms of our response. And again, I'm not proposing we do that specific thing, but it just sort of highlights like, part of this needs to be an evolution of whatever the particular needs have been identified. Still doing okay? Oh, interesting. Yep, I've seen similar kinds of things. Comment in the chat is that at least one library has sort of this progressive quiet as you go up. there can be those kinds of things, right? That's a nice potential, enhancement, right? And then the idea, what I would say is, let's just really make sure this is clarified, right? Do you have labels on stairs and elevators? Do you have this described in orientation? How is it followed through, right? All of those things are important to help people know how to effectively use that structure, right? And if they don't understand why, we can have effective ways to help present the rationale, right? You could have videos actually demonstrating how the different things look. And it might just be as simple as like a QR code or a link somewhere that says, well, what does it look like on the fourth floor? All right, moving through some of these predictions. So I didn't say it explicitly, but the idea is each of these slides is going through some of the different kinds of predictions we can make based on that autism diagnosis, right? So one of the areas I mentioned earlier was just this idea that sort of the emotional world, what people respond to in terms of their senses can be different, sometimes described as more extreme, in these things being impactful for people on the spectrum, right? So again, we can start to look at the environment and say, when might we predict that these things are more likely to come up? Right? So emotional experiences, when might someone sort of experience the world as more challenging, more anxiety provoking, those kinds of things? Well, maybe things like if they can't find some info, certain locations are tricky to navigate or find. Same thing with items, right? Like if there's something that's likely to be needed and yet it isn't always clear where or how you get that thing, right? Those could be impactful. And so what could we do? Definitely things like chaotic situations or environments, right? The really loud places, maybe it's really bright places, maybe it's really dark places, maybe it's really um, places that are very fluid where there's a lot of ins and outs and ups and downs and, those kinds of things. So what could we do? And that's where, again, it might just, maybe it's a building you work in where those things strike you like, yeah, I could see this is there's a lot going on here, right? So what do we do? Could be other kinds of sensory sorts of things, right? Like depending on if there are particular labs where you work, like what are the smells, what are the sounds, what are the conventions that are important there that could be uncomfortable? Different foods, right, have different smells. Could be different temperatures, different noises. Again, the first step is noticing these things. The second step is realizing that some people might experience that very differently. And then the third step is saying, well, how can we help people who experience this differently respond more effectively, right? So again, anything from mentioning certain things in orientation to mentioning that if you really notice different smells, sounds, chaotic sorts of environments, here are some resources, right? It's figuring out how to frame it such that people can contact what they need in terms of support or resources. And then us, if we notice cues that that might be happening, that we've thought through, what does that look like? Right. Oh, I noticed it looks like it's kind of a loud place. Would you like some information on something, right? Whatever that thing might be. If we have that ready to go, it's much easier to do. So things like signage, right? So again, comes back to communication, but now it's about a particular aspect of campus life or experience. Might be as simple as signs. Could be through email, could be vocal, and that often requires familiarity, right? So how do we help others in being more familiar? It's often through things like training, right? But again, sort of that real community approach allows us to see people as having value, having them understand we're trying to be supportive of everyone, and all of that can build towards better outcomes. I'm always a huge advocate for just responding with kindness, right? Being clear, oh, I'm Mark, I'm a faculty member, and, if I can help, I want to. So, if there's anything I can do or you have questions, please let me know, right? Those kinds of things tend to go pretty far because it's opening yourself up to say, if there's something you need, great. If not, that's fine too, right? Can be a pretty reasonable approach if you're not sure what to do. And then often sort of, plan C can be things like who's maybe a better contact with more expertise if we're worried this is a more, sort of impactful or complex situation, right? So what is that next resource? it's just good to have that clarified both for people on campus. If you have any real concerns in terms of how you're experiencing campus, this is a good place to go. But also staff, if you sort of try and you offer, through that sort of gentle approach of, oh, I noticed that there's a lot going on here. Do you have any questions? And that doesn't go well, say, okay, well, maybe if anything comes up later or you're just not sure, this could be a good resource that we like to share with students. Those kinds of things. Having that information can be helpful. All right. So if we now shift, so this isn't really meant to just be a discussion of all the areas where things can be challenging, because again, there's sort of the pitfall of thinking that it's locating the challenge with the person, and it's not meant to do that, but rather we're starting with a particular population of people with autism, right? And by definition, there are things that are different there, right? Like that's how the diagnosis is done. On the other hand, we can also say, what can we predict about things that are likely to go better or that could be strengths that this person will be effective in using, in their campus experiences? So things like routine often are areas of strength where the idea is once they've learned to do the thing, like all of us, it becomes easier to do. So how can we maybe support access to routines or developing routines, right? Things like time management. If we have resources, it could be something as simple as you have calendars that can be filled out, or you have templates for electronic sorts of calendars that can be dropped into, different applications. The idea is that might allow someone to more clearly establish their own routine, right? You add in videos for how to do that, and they may be in a better position to, structure their day in such a way that that routine advantage helps them be more successful. Written information that, visual in some form is often helpful. And again, that's kind of true for all of us. People sometimes describe individuals with autism as being very visual learners. The thing that makes it tricky to actually conclude that is that it's visual. Or if I say, Mark, go get your stuff and pack your bag and, tell me what time you're going to need to be picked up, right? To do that process effectively, you need to remember all of those things. If I write it down, guess what? You have it there. You can reference it whenever you want. So is it that you're really a visual learner, or is it the fact that the information didn't disappear in less than a second, right? I don't know what the right answer is, and I'm sure there's some variation, but the idea is by having visual or stationary or static kinds of information, people don't have to remember everything, right? It's there. So how can we help those resources be more available? Teaching people to write things down, right? Really simple. And it could just be, information that's shared occasionally to help yourself manage a complex world and life. Here are some strategies for taking notes on what to do, right? Those kinds of things. Rule following, again, it's important. That goes back to sort of the campus community that you're looking to establish. Might be a department, might be particular settings, but the idea is the clearer we can state those, that can really support the success of people with autism, because rules tend to make sense. Again, that's a static thing. It doesn't change and can fit with sort of, common strengths. Helps to review them. Again, just like all of us, when these things are reviewed, we tend to remember them better. People on the spectrum tend to be direct and or honest. You can phrase it in different ways, but the idea is there isn't a lot of deception that tends to go along, just because, again, sort of the nature of the disability is the world is more concrete. Those subtle sorts of social pieces are trickier for whatever reason. And so that can be a real strength, right? Asking questions, getting answers, you're going to tend to get honest feedback. A lot of people on the spectrum also have very focused attention, right? So again, really good strength, and it's just what is that focused on, right? So how can we maybe help focus attention? And sometimes that's just, support in where to focus your attention when, helping them learn where to focus when, like what are the rules in certain areas, right? You might be able to combine some of these things. But again, just thinking about these as areas of strength, we might be able to describe things in certain ways where we help them experience options, at least for routines or, certain rules by providing information in these kinds of ways. It might allow them to be more successful. Right, so again, it's just meant to be part of what we can reflect on when we're thinking about these opportunities and how we can structure things to help more people be more successful. All right. Doing pretty good on time because we're getting down to the end of it where, lots of examples trying to move from the conceptual to the practical and into what it actually looks like. So if we're actually going to try and do this stuff, what do we need to do? We need to ask questions like, what are the key resources, right? So depending on your role, where are you likely to contact or interact with students on campus or different people on campus? What are the sort of primary activities in your role? And then how does that extend into the different kinds of things we talked about, right? So you could ask questions like, what are some familiar phrases or methods of support that you are likely to be involved in, right? Are there things you could put on paper? Could it be a process? Could it be a decision tree? Is it relevant to have a video model of something or different kinds of examples? Some examples here, again, libraries have a certain kind of structure, so there's likely to be certain things happening there. So have we done what we can to support neurodiversity, different experiences? What about a fitness center or gym or anything related to art, right? Other kinds of resources, right? Where each of these has a different sort of structure and set of experiences to a lot of other sort of more classroom-based campus experiences, right? So what can we do to help there? For the universal design for learning piece, it definitely leads to this idea of having multifaceted options, right? So describe things, show things, include step by step, write it down, model it, right? By presenting the information in a variety of ways, we're more likely for a person to experience like, oh yeah, I get it now, right? Like that's the thing we want. And then the really nice part is when you experience the world that way, like, oh, I get it, you want to come back, right? You want to come back to campus, you want to come back to that building, you want to come back to that person because the world makes sense. Consider if anything may be off-putting, right? So again, that's sort of the sensory piece. Is there anything intense or unusual? Could be sights, smells, textures, whatever. But again, if we can notice that, then we're in a position to maybe set something up differently, have another alternative, have additional structure, support, whatever seems to be a good option for that situation. Incorporating advanced notice. Again, once we identify something, think, how could I help this person be aware that this will come up? And how can I help this person be ready to respond in a way that fits for them? So an example there would be something that's very discreet. If we know there's going to be intense cleaning, right? So there might be different chemical smells and things like that. Don't wait until the day and put a sign up. Think, we're going to be doing this next week, right? It'll smell like chemicals. Consider a different route, right? Or if it's going to be construction, same sort of thing. It's going to be noisy. You could go around the building. Those kinds of things are simple differences that could be pretty impactful for some people. Could even be in the next room, the next building, those kinds of things. But the idea is, again, just thinking in terms of how else might this be experienced. Consider time to practice or warm up, right? So depending on what the thing is, right? If it's lab work or if it's, some other kind of situation, might be worth offering. If you have any questions or want to see the environment first, here are some times you could come, or those kinds of things, right? Just a way to respond to someone who might say, that's going to be hard for me, or that's going to be different, or that's not my favorite. Whatever the thing is, we can think about some different options. Big one that's hard to talk about, the idea is how can we connect here and now to then and there, right? So it has to do with a process that's described as generalization. Is there something we can do now to help a person be more successful later? You can think of it in terms of self-management. You can think of it in terms of, um, adaptation or persistence or, a number of different kinds of things. But the idea is, are there things I can do now to support a person being more successful later? Lots of different opportunities and examples, but a really important part of this, because then you're helping them prepare for what they will find as impactful. And maybe add in more structured times to check in, right? So again, this gets a little bit more into the kind of the classroom sort of experience, but the idea is, if we build in more time to check in, that's more opportunity to get to know someone, to build some of that community, have them experience, comfort and trust so that we can get more information, that they can share more information, ask more questions, all those kinds of things. So thinking about, is there something we could or should do weekly? Could it be, before or after class if it's class related, but also other kinds of things. There might be opportunities to build in additional time just to be there to support our students. All right. So the last bit, given all of the different kinds of topics, all the different kinds of roles, if you, just kind of pause for a second and think, have I encountered situations that seem to kind of be in the spirit of this, where things were or could have been tricky, right? Sight, sound, smells, chaos, new systems, new decisions, new routines, all of those kinds of things, and think about what happened if something happened, what could have happened if nothing happened, right? That becomes sort of the first step in us actually taking action on these kinds of things. And then you can move on to that next step of the kinds of things we talked about, what seems like it's a reasonable option, right? What could you plan different? How could things have been clearer? What could be added in? All of those kinds of things, right? By having those discussions, or if you're in a role where, that's not the right approach, what could you do sort of on your own to prepare some of these plans? All right, so I've said most of this. I want to try and wrap up to make sure we have a little time for the examples and discussion. Couple different ways to think about this stuff. So individuals with neurodiversity, especially something like autism, are often more socially isolated, right? Again, it's closely related to the way the difference is diagnosed, and how can we then support opportunities to interact, right? And so thinking about it as a continuum of options that are more just an opportunity versus requirements, right? There are different ways you could go about that. Considerations for training, right? Of actually trying to set up opportunities to learn some different things or do things differently versus unstructured opportunities, right? Again, how does that fit into things? And I'm sort of a big advocate of the more we can have some of all of it, the better it's going to be than putting your eggs in one basket. But there are a number of other potential barriers to these kinds of things. So again, we have to be able to think about it flexibly. Big part of what we're trying to do with this talk is survey the landscape because of the nature of, this broad category of talking about what can happen outside of the classroom. Another thing to really just be aware of is people with these kinds of differences can be the target of mistreatment, right? So very unfortunate aspect of it. And so, being on the lookout for that. It can be intentional or unintentional, right? With the difference being, sort of more targeted bullying kinds of things versus just teasing where maybe they didn't set out to do something, but it's still inappropriate. Those things are usually accounted for at the level of systems already in place on a campus, right? But we still need to be aware of them. They still are more likely to happen with, these individuals. Keeping in mind things like you can be in person, online, and then what kinds of training and support do we have or could we enhance to help clarify this, both for sort of the student side of the equation as well as the staff or faculty side of the equation. Another sort of general barrier has to do with that limited time on campus, right? So all of the things that I've talked about, you might have students who are only on campus for a few hours a week. How does that fit in, right? How can we have arrangements that can be impactful if they're mostly someplace else, right? So again, thinking about different options and opportunities can be helpful. How do we present ourselves such that that limited time can still lead to that sense of community and trust? And then within roles and responsibilities, again, how can we do that? So what can we do? What can we share with our students and other people on campus so that they learn it's okay to approach someone, it's okay to not be sure, it's okay to ask questions, it's okay to whatever, right? Whatever we're predicting or what we've seen come up, how can we help that be a smoother process? Right, so there are likely some new systems we might need to consider, but also some current systems that are already in place, and we might just need to reframe it or come back to it and make sure it's clarified to someone. So to bring this back full circle again, if we can think about things like motivation, right? How can we support our campus community in being motivated to consider these kinds of things and maybe even consider doing things differently? There may be some benefit there. Thinking about different learning strengths and how we can actually share information, right, can be very impactful because what might be a barrier to certain students when it's presented in one form may be completely accessible and comfortable when shared in a different form. So how can we identify where we could add some varied information? And then just thinking about actions that people take. How can we create opportunities to do things in different ways and help people in uh, demonstrating their skills and abilities in different ways? Again, some of that gets more to the classroom, but there are ways we can do it here, right? How can you ask questions? How can you raise concerns? How can you interact differently with different parts of campus? All right. I have a couple examples. Um, I'll run through really quick, but then we'll shut off the recording so we can open it up to your discussion and questions. This sort of came again from the proposal from you all and notes and questions. So in terms of if you think of kind of a customer service type interaction on campus, there could be something that happens like a student entering a campus location, such as for registration kinds of reasons, or maybe there's a retail setting or a library or whatever, right? So they're kind of going in sort of as a customer, either for items or information. Immediately walk up to the counter, passing someone who is waiting, and approach a staff member who's on the phone talking and typing on a computer. And they say, I really need something now, right? It wouldn't have to be that language, but the idea is we can probably notice in this sort of situation, there are some social conventions that weren't followed, right? So that's sort of the idea of the first cue that we might have. Some of the thoughts we might have or we can ask have to do with things like what might be the common concerns with the individual, right? So I'm not opening it up for questions quite yet, just again, because of the recording piece. But the idea is I'm sure people are thinking about, well, a lot of people would say you shouldn't cut the line. Can't you see them on the phone? Those kinds of things were sort of the immediate interpretation of, wow, this is kind of rude or inappropriate, or shouldn't you be doing this other thing instead? And we can maybe think about it in terms of how could we communicate that in a way that's just more open to understand you may have perceived this differently, right? And so it might be a careful comment. It might be that we have another staff member who we could look to come help with the customer service part of it. But also importantly, we can think about what could we do before this sort of situation comes up. What could we do in that moment? I mentioned some of that, but again, there's almost never going to be a simple correct answer because it's not that kind of thing. We're talking about different perceptions of the world and what's reasonable to do. And the idea is we want to think about how we can have a couple different sorts of options in most situations up until you get to that thing that is clearly outside of what is valued by the community. So going to move past those. Final insights here. It's really just a summary of things I've said before. So thinking about what we're doing, can we clarify that? Providing directions, information in a few different ways. Are there things we can take advantage of that might connect better, like rules or structure? All right, so here are the conclusions. It's a big topic, but if we take some time, think about it, and put it in the context of your role, which we can't do great in a large format like this, but again, there is a nice sort of stepwise progression that we can all use thinking about what it is we do from day to day and week to week. So what systems do we have that we can enhance? What systems could we add as an individual? What might be a larger discussion? How can we interact with others with autism or other differences? It's really anyone, right? The idea is we're trying to set any assumptions to the side and say, well, I know why that assumption makes sense when I'm talking about a group. But now, what if a person comes into my office? What if I see a person in the hallway? Those group assumptions, just like the ibuprofen example, don't really apply. The idea is, what can I learn about this person? And how can I be prepared to provide information in a variety of ways that might make sense for them? And for you specifically, what information might you be likely to share, right? Depending on your role, it might only be a small subset of all possible things. For other people, it might be very wide reaching, right? So we have to kind of be thinking about that and be prepared to give information in a few different ways. And then what's the backup plan, right? Because we're not all in a position to follow through with the, you know, supporting students in a variety of different ways for extended periods of time. So what's kind of our role and opportunity and how can we enhance that? But also, if that's not being effective or the situation naturally moves on, what other steps might we be able to take to support the overall success of our students? Here's the same thing, it's more in here for slides if people are going to use this as a reference. This really is sort of step by step. What's a process you could go through to think about this? And now, pretty good for time. We have 20 minutes.